Thanks everyone for coming out on a very beautiful day. It's quite impressive to be here coming from Berkeley, where it's pretty rainy and pretty dark. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank everyone for attending. I'm going to give a talk on cause and effect and evidence-based policy. And as background for that, I think it's safe to say that really from the beginning of the field in economics, economists have been arguing about and proposing, advocating for different public policies. Adam Smith famously argued against mercantilism. David Ricardo, a man whose name I kind of secretly like, argued for free trade. Francis Walker, who was the founder of the American Economic Association, was virulently opposed to increased immigration. And so these are examples. If you go back and read these economists, they were often aware of facts about the world. Adam Smith's book has a lot of interesting insights. He was a very observant person. But their ideas and predictions and prescriptions for the economy were largely based on an assumed way that they thought that the world worked. And that really, is in the absence of other information is quite a useful way to go. But in the past 50 years, as we've gotten access to more and more kinds of data and the computer power to process it, and advances in methods by people like Jim Powell, econometricians, we've gradually shifted toward an idea that if we were going to propose a policy, we had to have some evidence. And so evidence-based policy, as I would think of it at least, requires a lot of times some kind of an understanding on very basic, what I would call causal questions. So everybody's aware that when you take your first class in sort of statistics, someone will say, well, correlation is not causality. And so what causality is attempting to do is try and assert that certain forces exist and will dominate if you let them. So for example, if you're thinking about a minimum wage policy, in order to understand how that policy would work, you need to know how much a rise in the minimum wage would affect employment, how much it would affect the probability that firms close, how much it might affect decisions of kids to go to work versus stay in school. Quite a few different questions, and that's a really simple policy. If you think of many more complicated policies, they have even longer list of questions that have to be answered. So today what I'm going to try and talk about is sort of as background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of scientific evidence, and that will take us through to randomized experiments and the idea of counterfactuals. Then I'll talk about social experiments, which were really the precursor to the field that I basically got involved in when I went to grad school, the field of labor economics. So these were experiments that were done in the 1970s. Then I'll talk about natural experiments, as Jim mentioned, or what sometimes people call non-experimental designs. Design means an approach or a procedure for trying to get evidence. I'll talk briefly about applications of these ideas to two topics from my own research, immigration and minimum wages. And then at the end, I'll come back and talk about, well, okay, that's great, but is it really true that policy choices are affected by evidence? And I think I'm going to end up a little bit more modest than many economists will probably think is the way to go. So what's scientific evidence? Well, hopefully you can see this. Yeah, I think so. So in high school, we usually try and teach kids about the scientific hypothesis and the scientific method, and the idea is that you propose a hypothesis and then you try and test it. Now, I have to say I went and talked to a friend of mine's kid who just finished high school, and I'm not entirely sure they were teaching that anymore, but let's pretend they are. And the classic example of this, actually something that I was taught many centuries ago when I went to high school in Canada, was Robert Boyle's air bell experiment. So this is from the 1680s. He was the guy who discovered air, that air is a thing. And he did this experiment where he invented a vacuum pump. And he did this experiment where he had a bird inside of a bell jar. And he pumped the air out and the bird died. And actually he gave demonstrations of this all over Europe. It was a very popular experiment. And this is a pretty well, I don't know, we probably wouldn't allow that anymore. Anyway, the reason why I mention that is because in a way when we first teach this scientific method, we're thinking about this thing where there's sort of a single decisive measurement. So if you want to know, is air necessary for life, and you pump the air out of the jar and the bird dies, it seems pretty obvious that that's cause and effect, that removing the air caused the bird to die. And there are many examples of that. A really famous example in 1919, a British physicist confirmed Einstein's theory of general relativity by showing that they showed that the light that came around the sun during a solar eclipse, the light was bent in exactly the amount that general relativity said it would be. And so that was like Einstein then became, kind of a name brand world product because that was such a decisive demonstration. It was known that there was some movement of light. No one quite understood it, and he developed this theory that actually predicted it pretty much to the nickel. But in many areas, and especially in my field of economics, there really isn't a single decisive measurement for many ideas. And one of the reasons for that is that there's too many things going on, and I call that natural variability in outcomes. So if I'm trying to figure out if a vaccine prevents you from getting sick, well, some people who don't get the vaccine, quite a few people don't get sick anyway. So it's very difficult. You don't have a situation where you can just do a simple demonstration of cause and effect. Now, if you think that the effect of some, I'm going to be using the word treatment a lot in this talk, so think about it as just a general thing that we're going to do to people or possibly to entire labor market or possibly to a firm or possibly to an animal. We could treat a larger group and look at the average outcome. And everybody, I think, even in the 1600s and 1700s, understood that that made sense because you could kind of average things out. And one example of that, the guy who kind of figured out that cowpox was a way to prevent or vaccinate. The word vaccinate comes from the origin of this. You basically give people cowpox, and this is a picture of a dude there inspecting this. This is a milkmaid, and in that time, the women did the cow milking. And so he's inspecting her for cowpox, which are kind of pustules all over your hands. And they took the pustule stuff, and they gave it to people purposefully, and that was found to prevent smallpox. Another version of this, in the 1800s, people started to do experiments with crops. They started to try and blend different varieties of seeds to try and improve wheat and other crops. And that had been known since Roman times, maybe even Greek times, that would work, but they were trying to systematically experiment with that. But the success was pretty mixed. And a famous statistician, R.A. Fisher, was brought in to try and straighten out the experimental results in a well-known research farm in England. And he decided that the way you had to do it, they had been doing these so-called experiments in this research farm for almost 100 years. And they concluded that it just didn't seem to make sense. And he decided what they had to do was they had to basically make sure that you took the seeds of different possibilities and randomly assigned them to different parts of the field. And this is what his field looked like. So you can see. Now, ironically, one of my jobs in high school, I worked at the research farm in Ontario, Canada, and my job was to cut the paths in between with a tractor. I didn't know at the time. I remember looking at these plots and thinking, why is it so weird how they're set up? Well, that was Fisher's idea. So this is called a 5x5 design. And there's 25 different plots there, but the arrangement of them is very purposeful. Now, that's a kind of a complicated version of something that around the 1920s and 1930s started to be better understood. And it's actually quite surprising. By 1930, we knew about special relativity and general relativity. We had an amazing understanding of many things. We did not really have an understanding of statistics. And the idea of a randomized controlled trial was really invented in the beginning of the 20th century. So here's the idea. I think everybody kind of knows this. You take a population of interest and you divide them into two randomly, okay? And ideally, the subjects in this don't know their own status. And so everybody's familiar with the idea of a placebo. And that originated from these kind of settings where you wanted to make sure that people didn't know that they were getting the drug rather than not, because just getting anything makes people better. It's well known that if you, I mean, everybody who has a kid knows this. The kid comes in, you could give him something and say, that's going to make you better. It has a significant positive effect. It's also important in principle in a lot of contexts that the people who are measuring the outcomes don't know, because oftentimes they're a little bit biased one way or the other. So that's the origin of the term a double-blind experiment. The people who are in the experiment themselves don't know, and the people who are measuring them don't know. And then what you do after a while is you just compare the outcomes for the treatment and control group. Now, you might ask yourself, why does that work? I'm not sure that anybody ever explained this to me fully, but it has to do with Star Trek. And I had to bring up Star Trek because I've known Jim for a long time, and I know that he and I are the only two people that know. He's the only person who knows more about Star Trek than my brother. So here's the idea. If you randomly split the population, then the average that you see for the control group, they didn't get the treatment. That's a pretty good guess as to what would have happened to the treatment group if they hadn't got the treatment. And that idea, if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about these days, you say that's the counterfactual. But what the counterfactual is it's kind of in Star Trek, this is the mirror universe. So if you remember first season of Star Trek, which I'm sure most of you don't, there was a situation where Kirk and Spock came upon an alternative universe where there was an evil Kirk and an evil Spock, because in that alternative universe, all of Western society had kind of gone in the evil direction, okay? And so that gave a way to think of the counterfactual. Well, we could see this better behavior gave rise to, happier people and so on. And if you think about it in this way, you can really understand why it is that we continue to argue over many things. For example, if you're trying to think about what happened with our recent burst of inflation, what's the optimal thing to do about trade with China, those kind of policy issues, the reason why we're still debating, or one of the reasons why we're still debating a lot of those things, is because we don't have a counterfactual. We don't really get to see the mirror image of the world which wouldn't have had whatever it was that we claim caused inflation. So these ideas of trying to do experiments got popularized in the 1930s and 40s. There was a pretty important version of the kind of experiment testing drugs for diabetes, and probably one of the most important experiments, really very important in the popularization of these ideas, was the Salk vaccine trial. So in the 1950s, early 1950s, there had been, in the 30s and 40s, several waves of polio across the country. And if you know anything about polio, you know that there's a certain fraction of, it's a disease that affects usually young kids, and there's a certain fraction of those kids who are permanently disabled, and a small fraction who basically lose the use of their lungs and end up having to sit in an iron lung machine for the rest of their lives at that time. So this was considered an extremely awful disease. And parents around everywhere in the world were very worried about this disease because it was extremely hard to predict. And Salk had invented a kind of vaccine that was kind of controversial because the virus wasn't actually, it was from a killed vaccine, so it's what they call a special kind of vaccine. And so he convinced, or helped convince, the March of Dimes Foundation to do this big experiment. And they got 1.8 million children enrolled, and they, in part of the experiment, they basically gave every second kid an injection of the polio vaccine, and the other kid an injection with just salt water. So they did do the blinding. The people didn't really know which one they had. Now, you might ask yourself, why do you need an experiment with 1.8 million? That's a huge, huge experimental population. If you followed, for instance, a couple of years ago when we had the COVID vaccine trials, they were more like 20 or 30,000. Well, one reason is polio is, although it's a really virulent disease, it's extremely low incidence. So the expected incidence is only about 50 out of 100,000. And the folks who were doing this analysis said, well, if we're going to actually have a convincing experiment, we're going to need a very large population, because we're going to want to be able to detect a difference in the number of cases that's measurable. Another problem with polio is it's very seasonal. And the third problem is that the risk of polio was very systematically different in different parts of the country. So they basically divided up the country into different counties, and then they conducted this experiment. And by the end of the experiment, it was considered a huge success, because a very small fraction of kids who got the vaccine got polio, and a sizable number of kids who didn't ended up getting polio. And so it kind of changed everyone, and immediately this became a thing that kids were getting all over the country. Now, in the 1960s, so this is not that many years after that, these ideas were of trying to do large-scale experiments were kind of combined with the enthusiasm at that time for reimagining social programs. So Lyndon Johnson had this famous speech when he first became president, envisioning a great society, and there was a lot of interest in redesigning health insurance programs, welfare programs, housing programs, all kinds of things. And a graduate student at MIT in the economics department, a woman named Heather Ross, basically wrote a letter to the Department of Health and Human Services and said, I propose that we do an experiment on a negative income tax. And I don't actually know. I once meant to ask her advisor, who was Robert Solow, a famous labor economist, or a famous economist of all kinds, actually. But I never actually got a chance to ask him. But somehow or other, she talked them into doing it. And so they conducted starting in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, 4 different experiments where they took populations. The first one was in New Jersey. Eventually, the most famous one was in Seattle and Denver. And they took groups of families, and some of the families received a different kind of welfare with a more generous benefit level and a kind of progressive reduction in the amount they got if they started to earn more, following a formula that had actually been proposed by Milton Friedman in the 1950s. So basically, Heather Ross said to the HHS, why don't you do this experiment to see if Milton Friedman's formula will work? And at the same time, they did another one that was quite famous as well, the health insurance experiment, which went on for quite a long time and is still informing quite a bit of discussion in the health insurance area today, believe it or not. So those experiments were conducted while I was in college. In the late 70s and into the 80s, the results were still coming out. By the late 1970s, in economics, it's safe to say that kind of enthusiasm for those kind of experiments was fading. There was, it was a different political time. People realized that these experiments had a number of issues that they hadn't fully anticipated. So the Salk vaccine experiment was incredibly well thought out. It was a huge design, and it was also done in a few months. These things took many years to run. While this experiment was on, some of the people in the treatment group and some of the people in the control group left town. They couldn't follow them. The economists who ultimately set up the design of the experiment were a little bit too clever, and they created complex experiments, which to this day people are still arguing about how exactly was this experiment designed. And so what happened was, in a way, these kind of ideas fell out of favor. And so by the time Jim and I got to grad school, basically this was a legacy. People weren't really talking about it. There were in the background a few people doing smaller scale experiments, mostly on training programs for disadvantaged people or ex-offenders. And that gradually percolated up, and eventually, these days, has become, again, very widespread. So in the field of development economics, especially, there's these randomized controlled trials, RCTs, being done, many hundreds of them being done all over the world. Really, the legacy of the of Heather Ross and others is it really took many, many years for it to manifest. Now, RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are very attractive because they solve this problem of knowing what the parallel universe would look like. Because they can tell you by having the control group what the treatment group would have done if you hadn't intervened. So in the welfare case, for instance, you said, I gave this set of families this different benefit system. What happened? Did they go to work more? Did their children do better? Did the families dissolve more? There were a lot of different questions like that you could ask. But there's some pretty serious problems with RCTs in a lot of scenarios. One is that you can't really be sure when you do an experiment that the results will scale up. So in some situations like mass vaccinations, if you said, well, the vaccine is a vaccine, it should work the same, that's true. But in other settings, for instance, if you said, I'm going to try a certain kind of intervention with training people who've had trouble finding a job, in the experimental setting, sometimes you have like a lot better people running the training program than you would if you tried to implement it in every state in the United States. Because as you can imagine, you try and implement something in every state in the United States, there's going to be a lot of randomness in how it's done. And then probably more importantly, many policies just can't be randomized. So it's pretty hard to think of a randomized experiment for the minimum wage. Like, what do? You say, okay, you're going to get paid the minimum wage and you're not. That's not going to work. So you're going to have to come up with something better. And it had been understood for a long time by social scientists and others that in many real-life situations, there's some comparisons that you might possibly do. So you could have situations where one group of people are exposed to a treatment or an intervention and one group are not. And you might be tempted to try and use the differences between those two groups as some way to inform a policy debate in the same way as you would be thinking about an experiment. So for example, a rise in the minimum wage could take place in one state, not in another state, so you might be able to do a comparison there. I worked a few years ago on a program, a school district in Florida introduced a program where they said, okay, we're going to screen every second grader, and we're going to find all the kids who could potentially qualify as gifted. In other districts, they didn't do that. They went with the usual program where teachers or parents had to push a kid into the gifted program. And we were able to show what that did by introducing universal screening. So that is a situation like that is what, as Jim mentioned in his introduction, is what sometimes is called a natural experiment. Now, I've always been a little queasy about that because it isn't really an experiment. And it's not even necessarily natural. So, but it is a situation where you might possibly learn something. And I'm going to give a little example of this in this talk. When I was putting together the slides for this talk, for some reason I remembered that Arizona doesn't do daylight savings time. I don't know why I remembered that. And all of a sudden I said, you know, I wonder, because there's a big debate. I don't know if you know, there's a big debate in California about daylight savings time. And some people think if you don't do daylight savings time, you're going to save energy because people's timing of energy use will be changed relative to the sun. And so, well, we should do a comparison there. So I'm going to report on the results of this after I get a little further along. Okay, there's a treatment group and there's a comparison group. Arizona does daylight savings time, other states don't. That's the comparison group. The problem is that we don't know for sure that the comparison group provides a valid counterfactual, okay, because these groups weren't randomly assigned. So, you know, it's not like somebody tossed a giant dice in the sky and said, of all the states in the country that are going to get no daylight savings time, it's going to be, ta-da, Arizona. They didn't do that. You know, it was legislators in Arizona in the 1960s. They were, you know, probably not very happy with what was going on in the federal government anyway. And then when the federal government says we're going to have daylight savings time, Arizona said, no, we're not. That would be my guess. Anyway, so you need to think about very carefully, can you use a natural experiment? Or is it basically worthless? Is it just one of these situations where correlation doesn't prove causality? So in general, if you have an actual experiment type setting, there'll be differences in the treatment group and the control group because for some reason one of those groups decided to do whatever they did and the other groups didn't. Okay? And you need to think about what to do about that. And this is an insight that lots of people have had. The particular term, difference in differences, I believe was invented by my co-author of a paper that I wrote in 1985, because I was there the second he invented it. And I remember this is my colleague at Princeton, Orly Ashenfelter, we were writing a paper and it was due the next day. And it was about 3 in the morning and we were working on the draft and he said, we got to think of some way to explain this. And he was smoking a giant cigar at the time, and people used to smoke in the office. And it was getting pretty late, and all of a sudden I said, I got it. He said, difference of differences. Okay, so what is that? Well, here's the idea. If you thought that if you didn't do anything, these two groups would not necessarily be the same, but whatever difference between them would kind of stay constant. So energy use in Arizona would kind of stay constant relative to energy use in Utah, month by month by month. And then when Utah goes to daylight savings time and Arizona doesn't, if energy use in Utah goes up a little bit, that would say, well, that was a bad idea. You were using more energy. Okay, that's the idea. And so what you're doing is you look at how the intervention changes the difference. And that's the reason why it's called a difference in differences. I hope I've got everybody's understanding of that. So as I mentioned here, in this example, we compare energy use in summer months in Arizona relative to other states before and after 1968, when Arizona dropped out of the daylight savings time program. So we say before that, Arizona and the other states all did the same thing. Afterwards, Arizona didn't. Did it do anything? And that's a really simple idea, and it doesn't always work, but it turns out to have a lot of, be helpful. So let me give a couple of examples from my own research, and then we'll talk about the daylight savings time. So the first example that I conducted research using this design was a study of the Mariel boat lift. So the Mariel boat lift was an episode in March 1980, and there was an uprising in the Peruvian embassy in Havana. And by the time this had been going on for a while, there was a couple of thousand people inside the embassy gates in trying to get out of Cuba. And Fidel Castro was in charge of Cuba at the time and figured out that politically the simplest thing to do was to sort of give up. And so he said, okay, anybody that wants to leave Cuba can do that. And they just go to the port of Mariel. And I think he was thinking that they would just swim away or something, without really thinking about the fact that just not that many miles away in Miami, there was a huge number of expatriate Cubans who'd come in 1961 and 62. And so they organized a flotilla and in a couple of months brought 125,000 people from Havana to Miami. Okay? And that's why it's called the boat lift. And Mariel is the port outside of Havana. Now, at the same time, because once this started to go on, Castro realized this is kind of embarrassing. So he kind of salted the mix by throwing in a few prisoners and people he wanted to get rid of. And the most famous example of that, if anybody remembers the opening of the movie Scarface, was Scarface, the criminal in Miami, played by Al Pacino. I don't think there was a real such person, but the opening scene of the movie Scarface is literally scenes from the Mariel boat lift where they're processing these guys. Now, what was interesting about the Mariel situation was these guys were given legal status right away. So you instantly had something like a 7% increase in the labor force in Miami. That wasn't intended, no one planned it. And I was working at Princeton, and at Princeton all the undergraduates have to write a senior thesis. And one of the senior thesis students I was assigned to help or supervise his work was a student named Constantine Alexandrakis. And Constantine, obviously a Greek guy, a Greek American, and Constantine had grown up in Miami, and he told me about the Mariel boat lift, and he wanted to do his senior thesis on it. He couldn't because he didn't really have any data, but afterwards, I decided, well, I'll see if I can do something with this. And so I realized I needed a control group or comparison group. So what I did was I looked at the data and I said, well, I'll try and find a set of cities that in the years before the boat lift had been kind of moving along like Miami was. And I ultimately settled on these four: Tampa, Atlanta, Houston, and Los Angeles. Now let me show you what some of the data looks like. So here's the first piece of data. That is the average weekly wage trend for people with only up to 12 years of school, so relatively lower skilled, only have high school or dropouts in Miami, native workers, okay? And this, you can see, it's a logarithmic scale, which economists love and is very confusing to everyone else. So we like to keep it that way. This is how we, earn the big bucks. But if you understand a logarithmic scale, when you go from like 515 to 4.95, that's 20% reduction. So in the period after the boat lift occurs in 1980, in that period, wages were trending down in Miami. So it looks like maybe the boat lift did something. But you can see a couple of things. First of all, it's kind of noisy. That's what I'm talking about. Remember I said natural variation? Like wages in different cities they're not just perfectly smooth. They kind of bounce around. And there's another thing going on, which is they were sort of falling before. If you remember the 70s and early 80s were very tough for low-skilled workers. So real wages of low-skilled workers were trending downward. And so this kind of illustrates the problem if you don't have a comparison group. I don't have my mirror image to know what was going on. You could look at that and somebody could argue, well, the Mariel boat lift shows very clearly that bringing in more immigration lowers wages. Or you could say, well, I think there was a downward trend and there wasn't anything going on. And a comparison group can maybe help there. So here's the comparison group. And I call it synthetic Miami because it's the average of these other states. And you can see, now synthetic Miami was basically designed to track Miami beforehand. Okay? I basically selected those cities. And you can see when you look at it this way, that probably nothing much happened, at least to the wages of low-skilled natives in Miami. Okay? And this was, this is actually a very simple idea. I wrote this paper and sent it off to a very undistinguished journal. Of course, the referees hated it, but the editor kind of liked it, and he kind of liked me, so he said, okay, I'll take your paper. Didn't think much of it, but it eventually became fairly well known, I think because it's so simple. You can almost explain it, to almost anybody. And it kind of illustrates this idea of a natural experiment. Now, I was lucky in this analysis because I proposed an idea that other people then followed up. You don't really know if you propose an idea what you're going to find. But so 4 different studies looked at different versions of this. One looked at what happened after the end of the Algerian War. So a lot of people who were French nationals had to get out of town quick in 1964, and they all went back to France. Similarly, at the end of the Angolan War, and that was in the 70s, a large number of Portuguese nationals had to get out of town and went back to Portugal. More recent history, in the 1990s, the early 1990s, the Russia-USSR kind of collapsed. And one of the implications of that was people were free to leave. And a huge number, one of the largest migrations really on record, of Russian Jews went to Israel. At the same time, a large number of people who could claim German ethnicity in Russia could go back to Germany. And Germany received hundreds of thousands of these guys over a few years. And so there's been studies of all 4 of these kind of versions of the Mariel boat lift. And 3 out of 4 show almost no effect on natives, including the Israeli one, which is kind of remarkable because it's such a large migration. The German one seems to show some negative effect. So these kind of large experimental studies suggest that there's probably not a large effect of immigration, at least on average, maybe once in a while. And other research designs based on other techniques, which I'm not going to get into because they're kind of complicated, they tend to show the same thing. So I think it has basically shown that not only was it possible to do an analysis of the Mariel boat lift, but it might have even informed what you would expect in other settings. Now, what about daylight savings time? Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this guy, I don't know this guy, Mr. Lee, but he wrote a paper in July 2023, and this is literally his graph. And what I liked about it is he called it synthetic Arizona. and you can see it's pretty good, right? He's got synthetic Arizona. This thing on the axis here is residential energy use per person in the state per year. And he's got Arizona compared to, I think, 5 other states. And it's kind of a weird average of the other states. But the largest ones are southern states like Alabama and Louisiana. And I think he had to do that because, of course, Arizona was, starting from a very different base than lots of other states. But you can see they're tracking pretty well together. That in 1968, Arizona goes off of daylight savings. And if you put the picture together, it looks like actually daylight savings time does save energy. So it didn't rise as quickly in Arizona as it did elsewhere. Now, you can also see, this is just like the Mariel boat lift study. You're not entirely sure, is that really the end of the story? I mean, that was 1968. We didn't have that much air conditioning. You'd want to do other studies. But it is very interesting, and if you don't have any other information, this is pretty helpful, right? So this is a good example, I think, of a simple example based on this difference of differences. And now I'll give another example from my own work. So I was a professor at Princeton for 15 years or 18 years, and we were sitting in my office in 1991, late 1991, and my colleague at the time, Alan Kruger, came into my office and said, well, they're proposing to raise the minimum wage in New Jersey. And we had both written, before then, Alan and I independently had written little studies of minimum wage outcomes. And we thought, well, okay, this is pretty interesting because we might be able to design a study that is even a little bit closer to an RCT than usual. Because a lot of times when you do a difference in differences, you come back to the data many years later, like Mr. Lee did with the data for residential electricity, or I did with the Mariel boat lift. We didn't really get involved in designing the data. So Alan and I thought, what if we try and design our own study? So we conducted a 2-wave survey of fast food restaurants in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. The first wave, we conducted it February 1992, just a month before the minimum wage was going to go up. And then in fall of 1992, we conducted the second wave. Now, I say we, I should say Alan and I did not do the survey. And we hired the most amazing survey person of all time. Her name was Susan Belden. And she got about 90% of fast food restaurant managers to answer the phone. Okay. So she did an amazing job for us. So she conducted, we surveyed about 400 restaurants in these 2 states. Now, so we were thinking about we could do lots of things. We can make sure that we understand exactly what's going on before the minimum wage goes up. We can make sure we can study what happens if a store closes. But there was kind of a flaw in that we didn't have data from before the minimum wage increase. So we weren't able to test or check that the gap between New Jersey and Pennsylvania was stable except for this intervention. So we weren't able to really validate the assumptions you need for this difference of differences. But we did have something in our back pocket. We knew, because we lived in Princeton and it's a high-wage part of New Jersey, that there were quite a few fast food stores in New Jersey that were already paying more than, or close to the new minimum, so $5 or above. So we thought, we weren't sure, but we thought we would be lucky enough that maybe there would be some stores in New Jersey that wouldn't be affected. So we would have 2 comparison groups, Pennsylvania and the stores in New Jersey that were already paying more than the new minimum. Okay, so what did we find? Well, our first graph is this. And this is kind of interesting, but it's not exactly what we expected. So this is employment and fast food restaurants, and it's about 20 workers on average. And New Jersey's kind of flat, and Pennsylvania's falling. Now, it's a different season of the year, so there's some explanation for the seasonal pattern. But we didn't see that New Jersey went down and Pennsylvania stayed flat. We saw Pennsylvania went down and New Jersey stayed flat. So it looked like raising the minimum wage, if you thought about it as relative to the counterfactual of Pennsylvania, might have been causing an increase in employment, but certainly no loss. And what about this other group of stores? So just to recap, there's a fairly large group of stores, about 40%, that were paying the old minimum, so they had to raise their wages 19%. There was another group, around 25%, that were paying $5 or more, so they basically only had to raise their wage a couple of cents, if anything at all. There was a third group I'm not going to talk about, was in the middle. So how does that comparison group look? How does that high-wage stores look? Well, this is why we were lucky. It looked like this. So by some miracle, I never completely understood why this turned out, the high-wage stores in New Jersey kind of paralleled the Pennsylvania stores. And only the low-wage stores went up. So that looked more to us like it was evidence that the minimum wage was the thing that was doing it, and it was kind of moving in the wrong direction. Now, these are small samples. This wasn't like the 1.8 million with the Salk vaccine. This is only a few hundred stores in each of these bars. So these differences are just not really statistically significant. They do suggest, though, that imposing a minimum wage doesn't necessarily lead to losses in employment. And we wrote that up and got into quite a bit of trouble with other economists because at that time especially that was considered pretty heretical. So they look pretty similar. And again, what's happened, this is just one study, and economics is not like, astronomy. It's not like a single decisive experiment. Okay? So just because you showed something in New Jersey and Pennsylvania doesn't mean that that's always true. Really have to rely on preponderance of the evidence. And in the last almost 30 years, there's been quite a few other studies, many of them much, much better than our study, using state-specific minimum wage increases for large numbers of states, combining much better data than we had, and so on. And basically, most of these essentially agree with us. There's also some other findings. For instance, a pretty nice recent paper shows that when you raise the minimum wage, you definitely get an increase in prices. If anything, it's really, no one has found, and that was consistent with what Alan and I found, it's very hard to find much evidence that affects store closures. So some of the things are going on, and there's still research going on in this topic, but I think that was sort of, it stimulated a lot of interest in that. Okay, so I've spent quite a bit of time talking about these policies. Now let's think about evidence-based policies. So we've got these quasi-experiments. Let's think about the case of immigration. And I worked on immigration for quite a few years, many papers. I kind of gave up about 10 years ago. But I would say that despite all the research findings, immigration policies in the US and many other countries have gone sour on immigrants. They've gone a little bit more negative on immigrants. And the general view in the population, not just in the United States, but in many other countries, Western Europe and even some of the countries that have traditionally been quite welcoming to immigrants like Canada, has become a little bit more negative. So does that mean that evidence doesn't matter, or what's going on? So a few years ago, more than 10 years ago, but around that time, I wrote another study with Christian Dussman and Ian Preston, and we had an idea about this. We said, well, maybe the problem is that people don't just care about the economic effects of immigration, but they care about something else. And there's not really a clean word to describe what it is. So in our paper, we called it the compositional effects of immigration. So there's a recent poll, I just found this the other day. It asks the following question. Now this is a very harsh version of the compositional effect that we were thinking about, but this is pretty obviously a version of the same thing. So about 30% of respondents in the US agree that immigrants are invading our country, they're replacing our culture and ethnic background. Okay, so they're putting some weight on the fact that immigrants aren't exactly the same as the existing population, and people in the existing population are much more comfortable with the idea that the country kind of stays the same. It kind of has the same language, maybe has some of the same cultural ideas, some of the same potentially religion and other things like that. And all those things are potentially changed by immigration. So what did we do? Well, what we did was we surveyed, we added questions to the European Social Survey, and they surveyed several thousand people in each of about 20 different European countries, not the US, but European countries. And they asked them a series of questions. One set of questions were about the economic effects of immigration. For example, there were 5 of these, but one of them was, do you agree that immigrants lower wages? So that's kind of a very clear cut. Another one was, do you agree that more immigration costs the government money? Or does it save the government money? And then we also asked a set of 5 questions about these, what we called compositional concerns. So, do you agree it is better if everyone in the country shares the same language? Do you agree that everybody shares the same religion? And versions of this. And so we had 5 questions on the economic side and 5 questions on this compositional side. And we averaged them together and we said, okay, this is how this person feels about the economic effects of immigration. And this is how this same person feels about the compositional effects. Which of those 2, or both, is driving that same person's ideas about should we have more or less immigration? And what we found was it's about 80% of the differences across people and how they feel about more or less immigration is mediated by their concern about the compositional side. Only a small fraction, a fifth of their concern, is about the economic side. So the economics is there, but this other thing is much more important. And I think if you follow the immigration debate or watch the way that people respond, this seems, I think, pretty obvious now that this is true. We did this, as I said, 10 years ago. Since then, I think of all the papers I've done on the immigration topic, this is the only one that actually matters. So I think what I would conclude is that maybe the evidence on the economic impacts of immigration matter. Those things that we worked so hard, these Mariel Boatlift studies and all these other studies, they do matter, and getting evidence on that would potentially inform a public policy. But they don't really address the main concern, the 80% concern about immigration. That's a topic that is quite different and not really about that. Now, what about minimum wages? Well, I would say maybe there's a little bit more evidence that the evidence mattered. So in the United States, many states have now got minimum wages that are quite a bit above the federal rate, including some surprising ones like Florida. The federal rate is stuck. There's still opposition to raising the federal minimum wage. In Europe, Britain introduced its first minimum wage in 1998. Germany introduced its first minimum wage in 2015. Now, I have to say, I like to introduce the German case because at that time, the head of the Economic Council in Germany was one of my former PhD students. And he was vehemently opposed to raising the minimum wage. But they did it anyway. Interestingly enough, there's 2 things that came out of this. In both these cases, there were pretty good studies because the data available to study this kind of thing is now so much better than it was 20 years ago. And especially in Germany, they have very detailed records that you can combine in very clever ways. And they basically don't show large negative employment effects. They show positive effects on wages for low-skilled workers, more or less a fairly positive view. Last year, the EU introduced a target for member countries of a minimum wage. So I think you might argue that it's possible that some of this new wave of legislation was influenced by some of the findings for the people that were doing these causal studies, but it's possible they weren't. For instance, I think that in the case of the German situation, Mrs. Merkel, who was the chancellor at the time, she was a fairly conservative person. Her economic council people were all very conservative economists, and they felt very strongly about it. But she felt the politics of the situation was much more important than the economics. So I think that we as economists have to be extremely modest about how much the things that we talk about and can provide evidence on are really relevant for the policy. They might matter around the edges, and I think that's good, but it isn't the only thing that matters. So to summarize, I think what we've learned in the last years is that we can use experiments and natural experiments and other research designs to try and answer difficult causal questions about how policies work and possibly inform debates. Methods like difference of differences are widely used in academia. They're actually very widely used in business. So I do some work in the tech sector, and many of my PhD students work in the tech sector. And there's a lot of randomized experiments in the tech sector. They call them A/B tests. So if you get on the internet tonight and order something from one of your favorite online shopping companies, there's a chance that you're actually in an experiment. There's actually a surprisingly high chance you're in an experiment. But there's many questions that those companies can't answer with the A/B tests, and so they're using these quasi-experimental methods. So these methods have made economists more valuable, and that's our number one job as professors of economics, to make economists valuable. Whether the evidence from these is really affecting government policies, I think, is less clear. I think that it might be having some effect, but I think, as I said, we have to be quite modest about that. So I think we've made some progress, but we aren't necessarily changing the world in quite as the way that some people maybe hope we have. So I'll stop there and I'll take some questions.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative. There seems to me that there are two possible situations where we raise the minimum wage. One is where the employer has the ability to raise prices to compensate, and the other is where there's no ability to raise prices. You have a margin compression. How did those considerations play out in the empirical work that you reported?
Those are good questions. I would say then the work that we did, we had a survey of restaurants. We knew what prices they were charging. We could see them raising prices. And as I mentioned, that's been confirmed in subsequent research. But there is a little bit of work which says that in scenarios where employers can't raise wages, and then maybe the effects of the minimum wage are bigger on employment. But I think that's still somewhat controversial. There's a theoretical model that says that that doesn't have to work that way. It was invented by a British economist named Joan Robinson in the 1930s. And so that theory is now kind of used widely. It's a theory of like firms set wages, in part understanding that if they set a higher wage, they can get more workers. If they set a lower wage, they're going to have some vacancies, but they're going to save money. And there's a reality to that. Most firms do understand that they have some market power. And in that market power world, which is now kind of becoming the more standard model in labor economics, as it is in the study of pricing of products for firms, it's a little bit more complicated. But I think that the basic thing you've raised is certainly out there. We didn't try and study it, but I've stopped working on minimum wages in 1996. Yeah, I lost a lot of friends over that, so I decided I had to move on. Yeah.
Any questions?
So if economists cannot convince politicians to implement these sort of policies, but then you say that economists are working with firms. Firms are willing to, use our econometric methods or whatever. Do you think that firms then can be a conduit for influencing politicians? Can the economists use those relationships, or what do you see as a possible avenue to try and influence public policy?
I think one of the problems, yeah, that's a good question too. I think one of the issues is what you're doing when you're running a firm is pretty clear. You're trying to sell products and make money. Right? So you have very clear objectives. And if you're trying to set social policy, almost always there's a winner and loser. So you raise the minimum wage, okay, maybe even if it doesn't kill any jobs, the owners of the firms are worse off. My uncle owns a bunch of McDonald's stores. He's never too happy about raising the minimum wage. And if you do that enough, you're going to potentially lower the value of the properties that are sold for retail, malls and so on. And they're in some difficulty now already. So you're kind of killing the retail sector, land values. So even if there's no employment effects, there's other effects. So there's always winners and losers. And so some of what's going on in politics is the winners and losers are pushing. Whereas in a business, it's a little bit clearer that we know exactly how to weigh that. And we're going to add it up in terms of net revenue or profit or something. So I think it's a little bit easier in that setting. Even in companies, of course, there's big debates because whoever is in charge of one policy usually likes it if their policy seems better. Yeah.
In your graph on Mariel lift, you had that down.
Yeah.
You discussed a few causal factors, but there's so many other causal variables that they seem to swamp all of your examples, both Miami, Los Angeles, Atlanta, that were impacting the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I just don't see how you can take all those out. I mean, in the late 70s, you had the high inflation.
Yeah.
Reagan took over in the early 80s, and he broke the unions. That had a huge impact. There's just so many such political, sociological that were going on.
Yeah, that's why I think of that as a case study. It isn't really, that's why in economics almost always we don't have, any single case study doesn't really prove that something is necessarily correct. What it does is it sort of says, look, here's a case where there's a fairly large increase in immigration and it didn't have these negative effects, so maybe we should look more deeply. And then I think the follow-on studies and other studies which compare multiple cities and multiple periods and so on, I think you start to put all of that evidence together. They use some of the same ideas in terms of differences, but they use it, in more complicated ways and sometimes with combining multiple episodes in clever ways. So I wouldn't say that I certainly wouldn't use the Mariel boat lift as say, okay, we should therefore raise immigration. I'm just saying that was an example of how you could test or this approach of using a difference in differences in a natural experiment to test what the effect was. And I certainly agree that in a single study like that, that's one reason why it was published in a very modest journal. Yes. It's a good learning example for how to do it, but it doesn't necessarily prove that particular thing. I think what you read, what I was thinking about in terms of the immigration literature is not my paper per se, but all the papers that followed as a group, I think was much more decisive. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you for your presentation. The question I had was, when you're doing a DID, you mentioned that you're using different states as, you're using weights and different states to create a synthetic counterfactual. What does, in terms of when you're doing it, so it's kind of hard to imagine creating a synthetic Arizona, well, even though it's not your study, but so what would that mean? Like, what criteria would it have to fulfill in order to be a synthetic?
Right. So the way I did it was very informal because I did it in 1989, and I didn't really quite know what I was doing. But the way that it's subsequently been understood and formalized is by an economist named Alberto Abadie at MIT. And he realized that the way you could do it is you could try and select the comparison group so that they matched, basically what I did informally, so that they matched the trend beforehand. So the guy who did the study of the daylight savings time, he chose combinations of other states so that when you put them together, they trended just like Arizona up to 1967, excuse me. He said, okay, I'm going to stop then. I'll make sure they track for 10 years and then I'll see what happened. So that's how they do it. And people use that method a lot, actually, in lots of different settings. It isn't, if you could, you'd like to do an RCT. But in the absence of an RCT, it's helpful. It isn't necessary. There's some problems with it, but yeah, that's how they do it.
Thank you.
Your question?
David, you mentioned you were working for a tech company now. I have two questions related to this. First is for students in the room. Can you share with us that what specific abilities that tech companies are looking for students, say, with e-commerce? Second is that I heard tech companies, they care about prediction power more than causal relationships. What is your experience with this comment?
Okay. Well, the answers are going to be related. So different tech companies have different things, but a lot of them need a combination of some modeling skills, because a lot of times you're trying to understand a thing that doesn't really exist, like a market that is only partially existing so far. So you need to be able to put together pieces of evidence and say, here's my, in the tech company that I work for, they call it a mental model. In economics, we call it a toy model. Here's our toy model. And you think about that, and then you combine that with data and quasi-experimental evidence or some A/B testing. So they need a wide range of skills that we would teach most PhD students. Modeling skills, as well as data analysis skills. The forecasting side, there are parts of different companies that do forecasting, but that's not a part that I know about. The people that I have supervised who've gone into tech, that's not a thing that they do. I think there is a part of most large companies that's involved in forecasting. I don't really know. I don't think that's the major job that most economists have. I think the major job is more bolts and nuts stuff, like what would happen if we tried to do this? And let's try it out in Minneapolis tomorrow afternoon and see what happens. And we'll run it there for a couple of months and see if it works. That's the kind of thing that people are doing.
Any questions?
Yeah, you jokes, or maybe there's truth to this, that you kind of lost some friends over your findings, over your studies, because of the findings are shocking, or maybe kind of due to current, labor economics trend. Have you encountered something recently, the last few years, that has similarly shocked you to say, oh wow, this is like something very unexpected, or something kind of out of
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. What's the most surprising thing that I've seen recently? Yeah. That's one way to put it, right? Yeah. Well, it's not actually a research finding, but I think it's sort of related to research findings. So I was involved with a group that advises the University of California system. And, coming out of COVID, it was 2022 or 2023, we had this inflation burst that was kind of unexpected, but some people said, well, and then the Fed was going to go into a policy of raising interest rates. And I would say 8 out of 10 economists thought that was going to cause a recession. Pretty serious recession, or at least a modest recession. And it didn't. At least not yet. It's been quite a while. And so that, I think, is actually very surprising, because it was, I'm not a macroeconomist, but my colleagues who are macro specialists, they were, they took all the evidence and said, this looks, if we base it on past evidence and so on, we're almost surely going to have a modest recession at a minimum. And so, and everybody kind of thought that, all business economists and everything, and we didn't. So that's a great opportunity for research, because when something like that happens, it says something we didn't understand just happened. What did we get wrong? And unfortunately, it's macro, so we don't have very good counterfactuals. That we can't. It's going to be very difficult, but it is definitely interesting. And I was one of the, I'm a more pessimistic person, so I was thinking, oh, for sure we're going to have a recession. But it didn't happen. We managed to get inflation down fairly quickly without massive increase in unemployment. So that's lucky for the economy and for lots of people, but I think it was kind of unexpected.